This episode is brought to you by Marantz Model 40N, ISA's Smart Amplifier of the Year. The most musical sound, simplified.
Futurefy. We made a video about the concept of Futurefy a few months ago, and it went all the way from pretty much nothing to a full set of streaming active loudspeakers. But I think the sweet spot for Futurefy for most people, especially you old school enthusiasts, and you know what I'm talking about there, don't you? I think the sweet spot is a pair of passive speakers and then a streaming amplifier. So an amplifier that has the DAC and the streamer and maybe a phono stage built in. And today we're going to build such a system for $1,500. And the kicker is that it's going to be all white. And we start with the loudspeakers that you can see behind me. They are the KEF Q150. They're a fairly sort of mid-sized stand mount speaker. They're a two-way, and they utilize KEF's UniQ driver array, where we have a 13 centimeter mid-bass driver that's made of aluminum or aluminium if you get the European version, and a 2.5 centimeter aluminium tweeter. And the reason that the tweeter sort of sits in the middle of the mid-bass driver is for something really, I think the concept is called point source, so that all the sound seems to emanate from the same point on the loudspeaker. And I think the idea behind that is to basically just improve, well, I think imaging, but also off-axis response of the loudspeaker, although that's not the only thing that feeds into it. And if you have a good off-axis response, then apparently, according to people like Paul Barton and Jack Ockley-Brown at KEF, you have a very, just altogether better sounding loudspeaker. Anyway, I'm going way off track here because I want to pull it back to talk about pricing. Normally, these loudspeakers sell for $599 US, or I think 599 euros or 499 euros. Anyway, for most of this year, they've been discounted quite heavily. And in the US right now, you can pick them up for a pretty damn good $299. So I think really what I'm talking about today relies on the fact that you can pick up a pair of the KEF Q150 at a discounted price. And the Q150 also has a rear firing port because it's a bass reflex design. And I believe that port was designed using computational fluid dynamics. I think that's what it says on KEF's website, in order to basically optimize the flow of air. So we don't get noise coming out of the port when we're listening to sort of more bass intensive music, but also just to improve the dynamics of the speaker. Now this is a very big sounding speaker. And by big, I mean big soundstage. And soundstage depth is also above average, I think, for this price point. But the bass is a little bit loose. And maybe that's because the cabinet on the Q150 isn't the sort of fully braced, super thick, super inert cabinet that we get from something like the LS50 Meta. I'll come back to the LS50 Meta in a moment. But the Q150 gives us more than enough dynamic thrust in the low end to properly mainline the sort of dub techno bass throb that we get from a record from, say, somebody like Deep Chord or Deadbeat, but also a more direct treble. I guess the lower treble or maybe the mid treble is also a little bit spicier, a little bit more direct than our previous choice for, I guess, really affordable stand mounts at $300. And those were the DALI Spector 2. And I'm giving away the DALI on my Patreon, I think either this month or next month, because these Q150 are going to take their place. Because yes, I think all things considered, they are a better speaker at $300. If you had to pay $600 for these and put them up against the DALI, no, not so much. But at $300, abso-bloody-lutely. Now I said I'd talk about the LS50 Meta, also from KEF, a much more expensive loudspeaker. Something like 1,400 euros. And they also use a UniQ driver array, but I think the driver is slightly different. And the cabinet, as I've said before, on the LS50 is much, I guess it's much stronger, it's much more inert. It's just more, than the Q150. You tap the LS50 and you get a very kind of unsatisfying sound, like it doesn't really do much. But if you tap the side of the Q150, you hear this thonking sound. You can definitely hear it almost inside the cabinet. And despite a slight lift in the treble that I mentioned earlier, the Q150 to me come on as a little bit, I guess they're just a little bit more laid back than the LS50. They just sound like a more easygoing speaker. To me, they sound looser and also maybe a little bit livelier. And maybe that comes down to that cabinet issue that I've spoken about. Not an issue, the fact that the LS50's cabinet is much stronger and more robust than the Q150's. God, I'm really talking too much about the cabinet, really, aren't I here? But the Q150 are plainly more opaque sounding than the LS50 Meta. We don't get the LS50 Meta's transparency. But that also means that the Q150 aren't as analytical as their more expensive brother. So if we play something like Spiritualized's debut album, Laser Guided Melodies, through the Q150, it's just more of a sort of easy breezy listen, even though we don't kind of get to see as far or as deep into the mix as we do with the LS50 Meta. And for some listeners, that actually might be a good thing. And the Q150's comparatively lackluster presence region, so the upper mids, where something like snappy percussion might live, might suit listeners who prefer a mellower, less incisive sounding loudspeaker. And that's especially true of people rocking, I guess you might call them brighter sounding amplifiers or brighter sounding AV receivers. And we'll come to that in a moment, but I just want to talk about an album, and I've got to pick it up from over here because I've left it down here. Just slide out of shot, come back. Okay, so I had a thumbnail on a previous video where I spoke about CDs and vinyl that I'd purchased in recent months. And the CD included on the thumbnail was not actually, I didn't speak about it at all in the video, so I need to talk about it today. It's this. It's called No Photos. No Photos on the Dance Floor, Berlin Techno 1992 to today. Now this CD was compiled by a chap called Heiko Hoffman, and it was done basically as a follow-up to an exhibition he ran over at an art gallery in, I guess you'd call it the western side of the city here, pre-COVID, 2019. And it was an exhibition that was really centered on club life or club culture in Berlin since reunification. Berlin is pretty much the techno capital of the world, even though techno technically originated in Chicago and Detroit. But yeah, there's a whole backstory as to how it came to Berlin, and Heiko Hoffman has written about this. I guess he's a bit of an expert in this field. But what's great, and the reason I'm telling you this is what's great about this compilation, apart from it being a really good sort of compendium of Berlin techno in the last 30 years, is that I shared that photo on Instagram, and then Heiko, I didn't know the guy, but he messaged me and said like, hey, I do follow you and let's meet and have a chat. So we did on Monday. We had a great chat about, I guess about techno. So it was really cool for me to talk about all the artists that normally when I mention them, I get blank stares from people. So I just think it's really cool that my sharing this out on Instagram begat a connection with the chap who compiled the CD and also curated the exhibition. And also there's a book as well. God, I'm really rambling on about this. We need to get back to our $1,500 Futurefy system because we need to talk about the amplifier. So the Q150's slightly more laid-back disposition plays a neat counterbalance to the more sprightly sounding Powernode Edge from Bluesound, which sells for $649. So that brings our running total to $649 plus $299. So we're looking at $948 so far, right? Just keep that in mind. $948 is our running total because both the amplifier and the speakers are white, and that sets the stage nicely for our all-white Futurefy system. So my Kallax unit that I store the records in behind me here, the IKEA Kallax unit, that is obviously all white. And the speaker stands, the solid steel SS6, are also all white. Now those speaker stands sell for $600. So if we add those to our running total, we get to like $1,557 or something like that, or $1,547 for the total cost of our system. Now, if I was building this system for real forever for me, I wouldn't use these stands. I'd opt for a much cheaper pair of white stands. You can get a pair of Nexus 6i from Atacama in the UK for about $100 or so, because if you save on the stands, you can then step up the amplifier from the Powernode Edge to the normal Powernode, which I think sounds a little bit plumper in the low end, a little bit sort of fleshier, and it's possibly a little bit smoother and less sprightly in the top. And that sells for $949. We mustn't forget about speaker cables. I'm using some just off the reel cables from AudioQuest, $50 worth, also white. Now we've reviewed both Bluesounds before, so I'm not going to go over their sound or anything like that in this video, but I do want to remind you that the BlueOS platform that lives inside these amps gives us Room Readiness, Tidal Connect, Spotify Connect, and Apple AirPlay 2. But there's no Google Chromecast. So if you want Chromecast, you could cut over to something like the SVS Prime Wireless Pro Soundbase. That's a new streaming amplifier from them. It's the same sort of thing as a Bluesound, except it doesn't have Room Readiness, it doesn't have Tidal Connect, but it does have Google Chromecast on board. It also has DTS Play-Fi, but we won't talk about that here. And the SVS amp sells for $699. But I guess the catch here is for our all-white Futurefy system is the SVS unit only comes in black. But if you're okay with that, you could also get the Sonos amp, which sells for $699. That obviously adopts the Sonos ecosystem, but we do get Spotify Connect on top. And Roon can stream to Sonos devices, even though they're not technically Roon ready, but there's no Tidal Connect and no Chromecast inside the Sonos amp. But the Bluesound, the SVS and the Sonos all have one very, very important feature to this Futurefy system, or for this Futurefy system, and that is HDMI ARC. And in fact, the Bluesound and the SVS specify the higher bandwidth HDMI eARC. I think the Sonos is just normal HDMI ARC, but it doesn't really matter because the crucial thing here is that we can connect very easily our streaming amplifier to our TV. I do this quite a lot. I use Apple Music on an Apple TV box and have that stream into my TV, and then from my TV into a streaming amp. Now it is restricted, I believe, to 48 kilohertz because of my TV, but that doesn't really worry me, and that's really only what I would call an audiophile nerd issue in the context of this system. But being able to use my Apple TV remote or my TV's remote to change the volume actually on the amplifier, I know it sounds in theory like a really simple, dumb thing. And I think you really have to experience it to appreciate how convenient it is, especially when with some HDMI, but not all HDMI ARC implementations, the power button also turns the TV off and the amp off when you're done, listening to music or watching TV. But it just integrates the TV, the TV viewing experience into the hi-fi system really easily. You just have to connect a cable from the back of the streaming amp to the back of your TV using the HDMI ARC socket on the back of your telly. And what I love about this particular setup, so the KEF Q150 with a streaming amplifier, in my case today, I've got the Powernode Edge, but like I say, you could use the SVS or the Sonos or the other Powernode. What I love about this is how wide and how big the sound is, especially with these KEF loudspeakers. And I emphasize this because it's much, much wider and deeper. The KEF are really good with soundstage depth. So it's wider and deeper, audiophile cliche really, isn't it? But it's wider and deeper than any soundbar that I've ever heard. Now I admit, I've not heard too many soundbars, but every one I've heard, I'm like, the vocal clarity is pretty good and the bass reach is pretty good, but it's this wide. It's like, why would you do that if you listen to music? So really for me, my message today is the reason one of the reasons I've put together this system is to give you some insight or some ideas how to put together something that's very low maintenance, easy to set up, easy to use. And yeah, it has, I guess, a bit more of a physical presence than a soundbar. But if you listen to, let's say more than 50% of your entertainment time is music, I would urge you, please go and listen to a pair of stand mounts on stands before you put your money into a soundbar. I know the soundbar looks nice and discreet, and maybe the other people that you live with prefer its sort of low profile on a low board. Yeah, you can barely see it, and yes, speakers stick out, and yes, some people that you might live with might go, oh, they're really ugly, but they sound so much more enveloping and so much more engaging with music than a bloody soundbar. Sorry, I didn't want to get into a rant about soundbars here, but I think generally speaking, soundbars for music, they're pretty shit compared to a system like this. So this system, $1,500 or thereabouts, depending upon the configuration that you go for, depending mainly upon how much you spend on your speaker stands. So you might even be able to get this like for $1,200 if you go for the Atacama stands and the Powernode Edge and get these speakers for $299. It's not going to cost you a lot of money at all. So the reason I made this video was to kind of showcase that, the fact that it's also an all-white system, the fact that I think it beats the sound of any soundbar, apart from in the bass. I don't think these speakers will go as low as a soundbar, and you might want to add a subwoofer, but you can get subwoofers that will do a pretty decent job for maybe starting at $500, maybe $400. I mean, the KEF KC62 would be a good fit here. It's all white, but it's pretty damned expensive in the context of this system. But the other reason I've made this video is really to sort of tee something up or to set a performance baseline for $1,500 in preparation for our next video. But if you like this one, please give us a like down below. If you like my attitude towards high-end audio and the aesthetics of it and how it looks and the simplicity and the Futurify angle that I've been, I guess, pushing for the last few years. If you dig that, then please consider subscribing to this channel. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. Futurify, I made a 13.5 centimeter, no, that's not right, it is 13. Sort of dynamic, might suit a certain kind of listener who doesn't want to